CHAPTER XV of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. Villa Vivalanti was astir early in the morning. Early, that is, for the villa. Castel Vivalanti had been at work 2 hours and more when Pietro went the rounds of the bedroom doors with his very obsequious "Buon giorno, Excellency. If it suits your convenience, coffee will be served in the Ilex Grove in half an hour." Coffee in the Ilex Grove was a new departure in accordance with Marcia's inspiration of the night before. And the Ilex Grove to day, as Bianca exclaimed with clasped hands, reminded one of paradise. The week of rain had left it a study in green. The deep, rich tone of ilex leaves arching overhead, the blue-green moss on dark tree trunks, the tender tint of young grass sprouting in the paths, and the yellow flickering sunlight glancing everywhere. Out on the terrace the peacock was trailing his feathers over the marble pavement with a conscious air of being in tune with the day. Marcia was first to appear. She stepped on to the loggia with a little exclamation of delight at the beauty of the morning. In a pale summer gown, her hair burnished by the sun, she herself was not out of touch with the scene. She crossed the terrace and stood by the balustrade, looking off through a golden and purple haze to the speck on the horizon of Rome and St. Peter's. The peacock called her back, strutting insistently with wide-spread tail. "You ridiculous bird!" she laughed. "I suppose you have been posing here for 2 hours, waiting for some one to come and admire," and she hurried off to the grove to make sure that Pietro had carried out her orders. The table was spread by the fountain, where the green arched paths converged and the ilexes grew in an open circle. The sunlight flickering through on dainty linen and silver and glass and on little cakes of golden honey, fresh from a farm in the Alban hills, made a feast which would not have been out of place in a Watteau painting. Marcia echoed Bianca's enthusiasm as her eyes fell upon the scene, and Pietro flew about in an unprecedented ardour, placing rugs and cushions and wicker chairs. "It is perfect!" she cried, as she retreated down one of the paths to get a perspective. "But there are no flowers," she added. "That will never do. We must have some lilies of the valley, Pietro. You fix a bowl in the centre, while I run and pick them," and she started off toward the garden borders. Here Paul Dessart found her 5 minutes later. He greeted her with a friendly "Felicissimo giorno, signorina." The transient clouds of yesterday had disappeared from his brow as well as from the sky, and he joined gaily in her task. "There," said Marcia, as she rose to her feet and shook back the stray hair from her eyes. "Could anything be more in keeping with a sylvan breakfast than these?" She held at arm's length for him to admire a great bunch of delicate transparent bells sheathed in glistening green. "Come," she cried, "the artist must arrange them," and together they turned toward the fountain. The spray of bluest forget-me-nots hung over one of the garden borders. The young man stooped and, breaking it, presented it with his hand on his heart. "Signorina!" he begged in a tone of mock Italian sentiment. "Dearest signorina! I am going where duty calls, far, far away to Perugia. Non te scordar di me." She laughed as she put the flowers in her belt, but with a slightly deeper tinge on her cheek. Paul, in a mood like this, was very attractive. As they entered the grove they heard the prattle of childish voices, and presently Gerald and Gervasio appeared down the walk, carrying each a saucer of crumbs for their scaly friends of the fountain. They stopped with big eyes at the sight of the table spread for breakfast. "Oh, Cousin Marcia!" Gerald squealed delightedly. "Are we going to eat out of doors? May Gervase and me eat with you? Please, please." Marcia feigned to consider. "Yes," she said finally, "this is my party, and if you'll be good boys and not talk, I'll invite you. And when you've finished your bread and milk, and you've been very good, you may have some—" She paused and lowered her voice dramatically while the two hung upon her words. "Honey." Paul Dessart laughed at what struck him as an anticlimax, but the boys received the assurance with acclamation. Gervasio was presented to the young painter, and he acknowledged the introduction with a grace equal to Gerald's own. He had almost forgotten that he was not born a prince. As Gerald shook hands, he invited the guest, with visible hesitancy, to throw the crumbs, but Paul generously refused the invitation, and 2 minutes later the little fellows were kneeling side by side on the coping of the fountain, while the arching pathways rang with their laughter. The rest of their excellencies soon appeared in a humour to fit the morning, and the usually uneventful first breakfast partook of the nature of a fête. Gerald's and Gervasio's laughter rang free and unchecked. The two were sitting side by side on a stone garden seat, the broken-nosed bust of a forgotten emperor brooding over them, engaged for the present with twin silver bowls of bread and milk, but with speculative eyes turned honeyward. The ghost of overnight was resurrected and jeered at, while the ghost himself gravely passed the cups. The sedately stepping peacock, who had joined the feast uninvited, became the point of many morals as he lowered his feathers in the dust to scramble for crumbs. Before the party ended, Sybert and Dessart engaged in a good-natured bout on Sybert's theme of yesterday concerning Italy's baneful beauty. "Paul has missed his calling," declared Eleanor Royston. "He should have been a ward politician in New York. It is a pity to see such a gift for impromptu eloquence wasted in private life." For a time Paul subsided, but their controversy closed with a laugh on his side. Apropos of riots, his thesis was that they were on the whole very jolly; and he upheld this shockingly barbaric view with the plea that he always liked to see people having a good time, and that next to sleeping in the sun and eating macaroni the Italians were never so happy as when engaged in a row. For his part, he affirmed, he expected to find them tearing up the golden paving stones of paradise to heave at each other. The image wrung a smile from even Sybert's gravity. It contained just enough of truth, and not too much, to make it funny. Pietro's announcement at this point that the carriages were ready to drive their excellencies to the festa dissolved the party in a scurry for hats and wraps. Sybert at first had declined the festa, on the plea that he had business in Rome. Marcia had accepted his excuse with the simply polite statement that they would be sorry not to have him, but Eleanor Royston had refused to let him off. "I've known a great many diplomats," she affirmed, "and though they are supposed to be engaged with the business of nations, I have never yet seen one who was too busy to attend a party. We shan't let you off on that score." Somewhat to Paul's secret annoyance, and not entirely to Marcia's gratification, he finally consented to change his mind. As the carriage started, Marcia glanced back toward the lodge's steps, where the two little boys, one with yellow curls and one with black, were standing hand in hand, wistfully watching the departure. "Good-bye, Gerald and Gervasio," she called. "If you are very good, I'll bring you something nice from the festa." The Copley pilgrimage was not the only one bound for Genazzano that day. They passed on the road countless bands of contadini, both on foot and on donkey back, journeying toward the festa, their babies and provisions and baskets on their heads. Genazzano, on St. Mark's Day, widely unites pleasure and piety, with masses in the cathedral and jugglers in the piazza. The party from the villa devoted the larger share of their time to the piazza, laughing good-naturedly at the Inglesi, which was shouted after them at every turn. They lunched on the terrace of the very modest village inn, in company with a jovial party of young Irish students from the Propaganda, who seemed to treat the miracles of the wonder-working Madonna in the light of an ecclesiastical joke. The afternoon found the sight-seeing ardour of the two elder ladies somewhat damped. There was to be a function in the cathedral at 3, and they stated their intention of stopping quietly in the low raftered parlour of the inn until it should commence. Eleanor Royston issued a frank invitation to Sybert to explore the old Colonna castle which surmounted the town, and he accepted with what struck Marcia as a flattering show of interest. In regard to Laurence Sybert, she herself was of many minds. A very considerable amount of her old antagonism for him remained, mixed with a curiosity and interest in his movements out of all proportion to the interest he had ever expended upon her. And to-day she was experiencing a fresh resentment in the feeling that his attitude toward Eleanor was more deferential than toward herself. It was a venturesome act for any man to awaken Marcia's pique. Meanwhile she had Paul, and the slight cloud upon her brow vanished quickly as she and Margaret and the young man turned toward the piazza. Paul was in holiday humour, and the contagion of his fun was impossible to escape. He wore a favour in his hat and a gilt medal of the Madonna in his buttonhole. He laughed and joked with the people in the booths. He offered his assistance to a prestidigitator who called for volunteers. He shot dolls with an air rifle and carried off the prize, a gaudily decorated pipe, which he presented with a courtly bow to a pretty peasant girl, who with frank admiration had applauded the feat. Finally, he brought to a triumphant close a bargain of Marcia's. She had expressed a desire for a peculiar style of a head-dress, a long silver pin with a closed fist on the end, worn by the women from the Volscian villages. Paul readily agreed to acquire one for her. The spilo was plucked from an astonished woman's head, and the bargaining began. Sell it? But that was impossible. It was an heirloom. It had been in the family for many generations. She could not think of parting with it. Not perhaps for its weight in silver? The money was jingled before her eyes. She wavered visibly. Paul demanded scales. They were brought from the tobacco shop, the tobacconist importantly presiding. The spilo was placed on one side, lira on the other, 6, 7, 8. The woman clasped her hands ecstatically as the pile grew. 9, 10. The scales hesitated. At 11 they went down with a thud, and the bargain was completed. A pleased murmur rippled through the crowd, and some one suggested, "Now is the signorina sposata," for according to Volscian etiquette only married women might wear the head-dress. Marcia shook her head with a laugh. She and Paul, standing side by side, made an effective couple, and the peasants noted it with pleased appreciation. Italians are quick to sympathize with a romance. "Promessi sposi," some one murmured, this time with an accent of delighted assurance. Paul cast a sidewise glance at Marcia to see how she would accept this somewhat public betrothal. She repudiated the charge again, but with a slightly heightened colour, and the crowd laughed gaily. As the two turned up the steep street toward the cathedral, Paul held out his hand. "Give me the pin," he said. "I will carry it in my pocket for you, since you are not entitled, as yet, to wear it." Marcia handed it over, trying not to look conscious of the undertone in his voice. He was very convincing to day. She was reconsidering her problem. In the crowded little piazza before the cathedral they found the rest of the party. They all mounted the steps and stood in a group, watching the processions of pilgrims with votive offerings. They came in bands of 50 and 100, bearing banners and chanting litanies. As they approached the church, they broke off their singing to shout Ave Marias, mounting on their knees and kissing the steps as they came. Marcia, looking down over the tossing mass of scarlet and yellow kerchiefs, compared it with the great function she had witnessed in St. Peter's. These peasants, approaching the Madonna's shrine on their knees, shouting themselves hoarse, their faces glowing with religious ardour, were to her mind far the more impressive sight of the two. She turned into the church half carried away by the movement and colour and intensity of the scene. There was something contagious about the simple energy of their devotion. The interior was packed with closely kneeling peasants, the air filled with the blue haze of incense through which the candles on the altar glowed dimly. The Copley party wedged their way through and stood back at the shadow of one of the side chapels, watching the scene. Paul dropped on his knees with the peasants, and, sketch-book in hand, set himself surreptitiously to copying the head of a girl in front. Marcia watched him for a few moments with an amused smile. Then she glanced away over the sea of kneeling figures. There was no mechanical devotion here. It came from the heart, if any ever did. And they were too believing, she thought suddenly. Their piety carried them too far. It robbed them of dignity, of individuality, of self-reliance. Almost at her feet a woman was prostrate on the floor, kissing the stones of the pavement in a frenzy of devotion. She turned away in a quick revulsion of feeling such as she had experienced in St. Peter's. And as she turned her eyes met Laurence Sybert's fixed upon her face. He was standing just behind her, and he bent over and whispered, "You've seen enough of this. Come, let's get out." And he made a motion toward the sacristy entrance behind them. They stepped back, and the crowd closed into their places. Out in the piazza he squared his shoulders with a little laugh. "The church must make itself over a bit before I shall be ready to be received into the fold. How about you, Miss Marcia?" "It seemed so beautiful, their simple faith, and then suddenly that horrible woman, and you realize the ignorance and superstition underneath. Everything is alike," she added. "Just as you begin to think how beautiful it is, you catch a glimpse below the surface. It's awful to begin seeing hidden meanings. You can never stop." "Look at that!" he laughed, nodding toward a house where a pig was stretched asleep in the doorway. "He's evidently been left to keep guard while the family are at the festa. I suppose you've noticed that every house in Genazzano has a separate door for the chickens cut in the bottom of the big door? It's rather funny, isn't it?" Marcia regarded the pig with a laugh and a sigh. "Yes, it's funny. But then, the first thing you know, you begin to think what a low standard of life the people must have to keep their pigs and their chickens in the house with them, and it doesn't seem funny any more." "Ah," he said, "you're coming on." "I'm afraid I am," she agreed. As they strolled toward the upper part of the town, they came upon a group of men and boys talking and smoking and throwing dice in a prolonged noonday rest. It was a part of the pilgrimage from the village of Castel Vivalanti, and the group instantly recognized Marcia. The festal spirit of the day, joined to a double portion of wine, had made them more boisterous than usual, and one ragged little urchin, who had been playing the part of buffoon for the crowd, fell upon the two signori as a fresh subject for pleasantries. He set up the usual beggar's whine, asking for soldi. The two paying no attention, he changed the form of his petition. "Signorina," he implored, running along at Marcia's side and keeping a dirty hand extended impudently in front of her, "I have hunger, signorina, I have hunger. Spare me, for the love of God, a few grains of wheat." "That's a new formula," Marcia laughed. "It's usually bread they want. I never heard them ask for wheat before." Sybert turned on the boy with an air of threatening, and he hastily scrambled out of reach, though he still persevered in his petition, to the noisy amusement of the crowd. Marcia spread out empty hands. "I have no wheat," she said, with a shake of her head. The youngster turned to his following, mimicking her. "The signorina has no wheat," he cried. "Will no one give to the signorina? She is poor and she has hunger." Someone tossed a soldo. The boy pounced upon it and extended it toward her. "Behold, signorina, this good man is poor, but he is generous. He offers you money to get some wheat." Marcia laughed at the play in thorough enjoyment, while Sybert, with an angry light in his eye, seized the boy by the collar and cuffed him soundly. "Mr. Sybert," she cried, "take care, you'll hurt him." "I mean to hurt him," he said grimly, as with a final cuff he dropped him over the side of the bank. The crowd jeered at his downfall as loudly as they had jeered at his impudence, and the two turned a corner and left them behind. "You needn't have struck him," Marcia said. "The boy didn't mean anything beyond being funny. He is one of my best friends. His name is Beppo, and he lives next door to the baker's shop." "If that is a specimen of your friends," Sybert answered dryly, "my advice is that you shake their acquaintance." "I don't mind a little impertinence," she said lightly. "It's at least better than whining." "I told you yesterday, Miss Marcia, that I didn't think you ought to be running about the country alone. I think it even less to day. It isn't safe up here in the mountain towns, where the people aren't used to foreigners." "Why don't you suggest to Uncle Howard that he engage a nurse for me?" "I begin to think you need one." Marcia laid a light hand on his arm. "Mr. Sybert, please don't speak to me so harshly." "I'll speak to your uncle, that's what I'll do," he retorted. They had by this time reached the castle, and having crossed the drawbridge and the stone courtyard, they came out on the other side, with the noisy little town left suddenly behind. The mountains rose above them, the valley lay beneath, and before them a straight, grassy road stretched into the hills, bordered by the tall arches of an old aqueduct. They strolled along, talking idly, Marcia well in command of the situation. There was a touch of audacity, even of provocation, underneath her glance, and Sybert was amusedly aware of the fact that he was being flirted with. Quite to Marcia's astonishment, he met her on her own ground. He accepted the half challenge in her manner and was never the first to lower his eyes. They had come to a bank starred pink with cyclamen and backed by one of the tall arches of the aqueduct. "Suppose we sit down and look at the view," he suggested. Marcia seated herself on a projecting block of masonry, while Sybert lounged on the grass at her side. "Mr. Melville told me the other day," he remarked presently, "that he remembers having seen your mother when she was a little girl." Marcia nodded and laughed. "He told me about it. He says she was the worst tomboy he ever saw." "It was a very pretty picture he drew. I wonder if you ever rode the colts bareback?" "My mother was brought up on a Southern plantation, I in a New York house and a Paris convent. There weren't any colts to ride." "And your mother died when you were a little girl?" "When I was 12." "Ah, that was hard," he said, with quick sympathy. She glanced up in half surprise. It was the first time she had ever heard him say anything so kindly. "And the convent in Paris?" he asked. "How did that happen?" "Some one suggested it to my father, and I suppose it struck him as an excellent way to dispose of me. Not that he isn't an appreciative parent," she added quickly, in response to an expression on his face, "but the education of a daughter is a problem to a business man." "I should think it might be," he agreed. "And how did the convent go?" "Not very well. I didn't learn anything but prayers and French, and I was dreadfully homesick." "And then?" "Oh, one or two governesses and a boarding school, and after that college." Marcia laughed. "You should have seen my father when I suggested college. He clutched at the idea like a drowning man. It was another 4 years' reprieve." "It's a pity," he remarked, "that the French method of marrying one's daughter off hand as soon as she gets out of school doesn't prevail in America." "I really did feel guilty when I graduated, the poor man looked so dazed through it all. He asked me if I would like to take a little trip into Venezuela with him to look into some mines. It would have been fun, wouldn't it?" she asked. "I should have liked to go." "But, being charitable, you declined." "Yes, and having another plan in my head. It had been years since I had seen Uncle Howard, and I thought it would be nice to come over and live with him for a while." "And so here you are in Genazzano." "Here I am," she agreed. "But as soon as papa is ready to settle down respectably, like other people, I'm going back to keep house for him, and I shall take with me some 14th century Italian furniture, and some nice Italian servants, and give nice little Italian dinners." "And shall you invite me sometimes?" "Drop in whenever you wish." Marcia began to laugh. "Well," he inquired, "what is so funny?" "To be talking to you this way. I shouldn't have issued that invitation a week ago. You couldn't help yourself yesterday," she added. "Aunt Catherine made you come. But really it's your own fault to day." "Is that the impression I gave you? I am afraid I must have very bad manners." "You have rather bad," she agreed. "You hit it straight," he laughed. "No," he added presently, "Aunt Catherine had nothing to do with our walk to day. If you care to know, I'll tell you why I wanted to come. Yesterday afternoon I took a ride with a most charming young woman, and I thought I'd like to renew the acquaintance." "If that's intended for a compliment, it's of a very doubtful nature. You have known this same charming young woman for the last 3 months, and have never shown any marked desire for her company before." "I was blind, but I have been made to see." He commenced rolling a cigarette in a lazy, half amused fashion, while Marcia occupied an interval of silence by checking the progress of a black beetle who found himself on the stone beside her, and who seemed in a great hurry to get somewhere else. In whichever way he turned, a mountain of a green leaf sprang up in his path. He ran wildly in a circle, vainly seeking an outlet, his 6 little legs twittering with anxiety. Sybert stretched out a sympathetic hand and dropped him over the bank to a place of safety. "Now why must you do that?" Marcia inquired. "A sense of fellow feeling. I've watched too many women playing with too many men not to know how the poor beast felt. His progress was thwarted at every turn, without his being able to comprehend any underlying motive or reason or law." "It was good for him," she affirmed. "I was giving him a new experience, was widening his horizon. When I finally let him go he would have been so thankful to think of the danger he had escaped, that he would have been twice as happy a beetle as ever before."
"That is one way of looking at it," Sybert agreed.
Marcia watched him a moment speculatively. She was thinking about the Contessa Torrenieri. "Mr. Sybert," she suggested, "there are a lot of things I should like to know about you."
"I can think of nothing in my past that ought to be hidden."
"These are things that you wouldn't tell me."
"Try me and see."
"Anything I choose to ask?"
"I am at your disposal."
"Have you ever been in love with anyone?" He glanced up from his cigarette with an amused stare.
"What's this, a confessional?"
"Oh, no. Only you don't look as if you'd ever done such a foolish thing, and I just wondered."
"Half a dozen times."
"Really?"
"Oh, I dare say not, really," he laughed. "In my cub days I used to be, well, interested sometimes."
"But you outgrew it?"
"It would be a rash man who would affirm that. You never can tell what's waiting for you around the next corner."
She would have liked to put a question or so in regard to the contessa, but instead she remarked, There are some other things I'd like to ask you."
"I'm not so sure I'll answer if that's a specimen."
"Why were you carrying a revolver yesterday?"
"You strike me as a very inquisitive young woman, Miss Marcia."
"You strike me as a very mysterious man, Mr. Sybert."
"Why was I carrying a revolver? For a very simple reason. I have been travelling through the South, helping to quiet the rioters, and as that is not a popular occupation I thought it wisest to go armed. A revolver is an excellent thing with which to persuade people, though in all probability I shall never have any occasion to use it. I hope you are satisfied?"
"Thank you," said Marcia. "Not that I believe you at all," she added, with a laugh. He regarded her a moment with a slightly perplexed frown.
"What on earth do you take me for, Miss Marcia? An anarchist, a bandit, a second Fra Diavolo in disguise? I am nothing so picturesque, I assure you. Merely a peaceful private citizen of the United States."
"How do you come to know the baker's son, Tarquinio, so well?"
"I think I've answered questions enough. Suppose we have a confession from you, Miss Marcia. Have you ever been in love?"
Marcia rose. "It's 4:15, and we ought to be going back. The Roystons have to catch the evening train into Rome."
CHAPTER XVI. Of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. Is in the public domain. Marcia drove to the station with the travellers, leaving the rest of the party to return to the villa in the other carriage. She had a slight feeling of compunction in regard to Paul, and it made her more responsive to his nonsense than she might otherwise have been. In the rôle of cicerone he naively explained the story of the ruins they passed on the way, and the entire history of Rome, from Romulus and Remus to Garibaldi, unfolded itself upon that 9-mile stretch of dusty road. Marcia gave herself up gaily enough to the spirit of the play, forgetting for the time any troubling questions lurking in the background. When she bade him good-bye she smiled back, half laughingly, half seriously, at his parting speech, a repetition of the morning's pretty phrase, "Non te scordar di me." As the carriage turned homeward she smiled to herself over her yesterday's state at the prospect of meeting Paul. The actuality had not been so disconcerting. She did not quite comprehend his new attitude, but she accepted it as a tacit recognition of her desire to let matters stand, and was grateful. She felt very kindly toward him this evening. He was such a care-free, optimistic young fellow, and even supposing he were too ready to look on the bright side of things, was not Laurence Sybert, she asked herself, too ready also to look on the dark side? Since his words of yesterday, in the old wine-cellar, she had felt an undertone of sadness to her thoughts which she vaguely resented. As she rode along now between the fresh fields, glowing in the soft light of the April sunset, she was dimly conscious of a struggle, a rebellion, going on within her own nature. She seemed pulled two ways. The beautiful sunshiny world of dreams was calling to her, and Paul stood at the crossways, laughing, careless, happy Paul, holding out his hand with a winning smile to show the way to Cytherea. But deep within her heart she felt the weight of the real world, the world which means misery to so many people, dragging on her spirits and holding her back. And in the background she saw Sybert watching her with folded arms and a half-quizzical smile. Sybert making no move either to lure her on or to turn her back, merely watching with inscrutable eyes. Happiness seemed to be her portion. Why could she not accept it gladly, and shut her eyes to all else? If she once commenced seeing the misery in the world, there would be no end. Until a few weeks before she had scarcely realized that any existed outside of books, but she knew it now, she had seen it face to face. She thought of the crowded, squalid little houses of Castel Vivalanti, of the women who went out at sunrise to work all day in the fields, of the hordes of children only half fed. Oh yes, she knew now that there was misery outside of books, but she asked herself with an almost despairing cry, why need she know? Since she could do nothing to help, since she was not to blame, why not close her eyes and pretend it was not there? It was the shrinking cry of the soul that for the first time has tasted of knowledge, that with open eyes is hesitating on the threshold of the real world, with a longing backward glance toward the unreal world of dreams.
but in life there is no going back. Knowledge once gained may not be cancelled, and there was further knowledge waiting for Marcia not very far ahead. Two little boys turning somersaults by the side of the carriage suddenly recalled to her mind the boys at the villa, and her promise to bring them a present from the festa. Not once had she thought of them during the day, and the only possible present now was the inevitable sweet chocolate of Castel Vivalanti. She glanced at her watch. There was still an hour before dinner, and she ordered Giovanni to drive up the hill to the town. Giovanni respectfully begged her pardon, with the suggestion that the horses were tired. They had had a long journey, and the hill was steep. Marcia replied, with a touch of sharpness, that the horses could rest all day to-morrow. They wound up the gradual ascent at a walk, in company with the procession coming home for the night. It was a sight which Marcia always watched with fresh interest. Field workers with mattocks on their shoulders trudging wearily back to supper and bed; washerwomen, their clothes in baskets on their heads, calling cheery good-byes to one another; files of ragged little donkeys laden with brush, sheep and pigs and goats and long-horned oxen. Where they were all to be stowed for the night was an ever-recurring mystery. Under the smiling moons of the Porta della Luna, the carriage came to a halt, and the crowd of Castel Vivalanti boys, who were in the habit of scouring the highway for coppers, fell upon it vociferously. Marcia had exhausted her soldi in Genazzano, and with a laughing shake of her head she motioned them away, but the boys would not be shaken off. They swarmed about the carriage like little rats, shrilly demanding money. She continued to shake her head, and instantly their cries were transferred to the taunts of the afternoon. "Grano, grano!" they shouted in chorus, and Giovanni raised his whip and drove them away. Marcia paused with her foot on the carriage step, puzzling over this new cry which was suddenly assailing her at every turn. "What is the matter, Giovanni? Why are they always shouting wheat?" He waved his whip disdainfully. "Chi sa, signorina? They are of no account. Do not listen to their foolishness." They were the same children to whom she had given chocolate not many days before. "They forget quickly," she said to herself. "Perhaps, after all, Paul was right, and beauty is their strongest virtue." The Ave Maria was ringing as she turned into the crooked little streets, and the town was buzzing like a beehive over its evening affairs. Copper water jars were coming home from the well, blue smoke was pouring out of every chimney, and yellow meal was being sifted outside the doors. Owing to the festa, the streets were crowded with loungers, and in the tiny piazza groups of men were gathered about the door of the tobacco shop, arguing and quarrelling and gesticulating in their excitable Italian fashion. It had been a week or more since Marcia had visited the village, and now, as she threaded her way through the crowd, it struck her suddenly that the people's usual friendly nods were a trifle churlish. She had the uncomfortable feeling that group after group fell silent and turned to stare after her as she passed. One little boy shouted "Grano!" and was dragged indoors with a box on his ears. "Madonna mia!" cried his anxious mother. "Are we not poor enough already, that you would bring down foreign curses upon the house?" In the bake shop Domenico served her surlily, answering her friendly inquiries as to the health of his family and the progress of his vineyard with grunts rather than words. Amazed and indignant, she shrank within herself, and with head erect and hotly burning cheeks turned back toward the gate, not so much as glancing at the people, who silently made way for her. "Ah, you see," they murmured to one another, "the foreign signorina played at having a kind heart of amusement, but what does she care for our miseria? No more than for the stones beneath her feet." Laurence Sybert, coming out from the village, was somewhat astonished to find Giovanni drawn up before the gate. Giovanni hailed him with an anxious air. "Scusi, signori, have you seen the signorina? She is inside." He nodded toward the porta. "She has gone to the bake shop alone. I told her the horses were tired, but she paid no attention, and the ragazzi called wheat, but she did not understand." "They shouted wheat, did they?" "Si, signore. They read the papers, the Avanti yesterday." Sybert nodded. "I know what the Avanti said." He turned back under the archway and set out for the baker's, the place, as it happened, from which he had just come. He had been entertained with some very plain comments on his friends in the villa. As Giovanni suggested, they read their papers, and the truth of whatever was stated in printer's ink was not to be doubted. It was scarcely the time that Marcia should have chosen for an evening stroll through Castel Vivalanti, and Sybert was provoked that she should have paid so little heed to his warning of the afternoon. The fact that she was ignorant of the special causes for his warning did not at the moment present itself as an excuse. He had not gone far when he heard shouts ahead. The words were unmistakable. "Wheat! Wheat! Signorina, wheat!" The volume of sound sent him hurrying forward in quick anxiety, almost fearing a riot. But his first glance, as he came out into the piazza, showed him that it was scarcely as serious as that. Marcia, looking hurt and astonished and angry, was standing in the midst of a fast increasing crowd of dirty little street urchins, who were shrieking and jumping and gesticulating about her. She was in no possible danger, however; the boys meant no harm beyond being impudent. For a second Sybert hesitated, with the grim intention of teaching her a lesson, but the next moment he saw that she was already thoroughly frightened. She called out wildly to a group of men who had paused on the outskirts of the crowd. They laughed insolently, and made no move to drive the boys away. She closed her eyes and swayed slightly, while Sybert in quick compunction hurried forward. Pushed into the midst of the tumult, he cuffed the boys right and left out of the way. Marcia opened her eyes and regarded him dazedly. "Mr. Sybert," she gasped, "what's the matter? What are they saying?" "Can you walk?" he asked, stretching out a hand to steady her. "Come, we'll get out of the piazza." By this time other men had joined the crowd, and low mutterings ran from mouth to mouth. Many recognized Sybert, and his name was shouted tauntingly. "Wheat! Wheat!" however, was still the burden of the cry. One boy jostled against them impudently. It was Beppo of the afternoon, and Sybert struck him a sharp blow across the shoulders with his cane, sending him sprawling on the pavement. Half the crowd laughed, half called angrily, "Hit him, Beppo, hit him! Don't let him knock you down!" while a half-drunken voice in the rear shouted, "Behold Signor Siberti, the friend of the poor!" "Here, let's get out of this," he said. And, clearing an opening with a vigorous sweep of his cane, he hurried her down a narrow alley around a corner out of sight of the piazza. Leading the way into a little trattoria, he drew a chair forward toward the door. "Giuseppe," he called, "bring the signorina some wine." Marcia dropped into the chair and leaned her head on the back. She felt dazed and bewildered. Never before had she been treated with anything but friendliness and courtesy. Why had the people suddenly turned against her? What had she done that they should hate her? In the back of the room she heard Sybert explaining something in a low tone to Giuseppe, and she caught the words, "She does not know." "Poverina, she does not know," the woman murmured. Sybert came across with a glass of wine. "Here, Marcia, drink this," he said peremptorily. She received the glass with a hand that trembled, and took one or two swallows, and then set it down. "It's nothing. I shall be all right in a moment. They pressed her round me so close that I couldn't breathe." The wine brought some colour back to her face, and after a few minutes she rose to her feet. "I'm sorry to have made so much commotion. I feel better now. Let's go back to the carriage." Skirting the piazza, they returned to the Porta by a narrow side street, the boys behind still shouting after, but none approaching within reach of Sybert's stick. They had regained the carriage and reached the bottom of the hill before either of them spoke. Marcia was the first to break the silence. "What is it, Mr. Sybert, that I don't know?" "A good many things, apparently," he said coolly. "For one, you don't know how to take a piece of friendly advice. I told you this afternoon that the countryside was too stirred up to be safe, and I thought you might have paid just a little attention to my warning. Respectable Italian girls don't run around the streets alone, and they particularly don't choose the evening of a festa for a solitary walk." "If you have quite finished, Mr. Sybert, will you answer my question? Why do they call me Signorina Wheat?" He was apparently engaged with his thoughts and did not hear. "Mr. Sybert, I asked you a question." "Why do they shout wheat?" His tone was still sharp. "Well, I suppose because, just at present, wheat is a burning question in Italy, and the name of Copley is somewhat unpleasantly connected with it. Your uncle has just bought a large consignment of American wheat, which is on its way to Italy now. His only object is to relieve the suffering. He loses on every bushel he sells, but, as is usually the case with disinterested people, His motives have been misjudged. The newspapers have had a great deal to say about the matter, and the people, with their usual gratitude toward their benefactors, have turned against him."
"Mr. Sybert, you are not telling me the truth."
Sybert did not see fit to answer this charge. He folded his arms and leaned against the cushions, with his eyes fixed on the two brass buttons on the back of Giovanni's coat. And Marcia, the colour back in her cheeks, sat staring at the roadway with angry eyes. Neither spoke again till the carriage came to a stand before the loggia. "Well, Miss Marcia, are we friends?" said Sybert.
"No," said Marcia, "we are not."
She turned up to her room and set about dressing in a very mingled frame of mind. She was still excited and hurt from her treatment in the village, and very much puzzled as to its motive. She was indignant at Sybert's attitude, at his presuming to issue orders with no reason attached, and expecting them to be obeyed. Instead of being grateful for his timely assistance, she was irritated that he should have happened by just in time to see the fulfilment of his warning. His superior "I told you so" attitude was exasperating to a degree. She ended by uniting her various wounded sensibilities into a single feeling of resentment toward him. The desire that was uppermost in her mind was a wish to pay him back, to make him feel sorry, though for exactly what, she was not quite clear. She hung up in the wardrobe the simple dinner dress that Granton had laid out on the bed, and chose in its place a particularly dignified gown with a particularly long train. Having piled her hair on the top of her head, she added a diamond star and a necklace with a diamond pendant. She did not often wear jewels, but they were supposedly American, and irritating to a man of Sybert's cosmopolitan sensibilities.
"Quite stately," she murmured, critically surveying the effect in the mirror. "One might almost say matronly."
As she started downstairs, she was waylaid at the nursery door by a small figure in a white nightgown.
"Cousin Marcia, what did you bring me from the festa?" "Oh, Gerald, I brought you some chocolate, and I left it in the carriage. But never mind, dear, it's too late anyway for you to eat it to night. I will send and get it, and you shall have it with your breakfast to morrow morning. Be a good boy and go to sleep." She went downstairs with her mind bent upon chocolate, and crossed the empty salon to the little anteroom at the rear. She had opened the door and burst in before she realized that anyone was inside. Then, before the apology had risen to her lips, she had heard her uncle's words. "Good heavens, Sybert, what can I do? You know my hands are tied. Willard Copley would let the last person in Italy starve if he could make one more dollar out of it." Marcia stood still, looking at her uncle in horror while the meaning of his words sank into her mind. He whirled around upon her. His face was whiter and sterner than she had ever seen it.
"What do you want, Marcia?" he asked sharply. "Why don't you knock before you come into a room?"
Marcia's face flushed hotly. "I'm sorry, Uncle Howard. I was in a hurry, and I didn't know anyone was here."
"Oh, I beg your pardon, Marcia. I spoke hastily."
She hesitated in the doorway and then faced him again. "I heard what you said. Would you please tell me what you mean?"
Copley cast an annoyed glance at Sybert, who was standing in the embrasure by the window with his hands in his pockets and his eyes bent upon the floor. Sybert glanced up with a little frown, and then with a half perceptible shrug turned away and looked out of the window. "I might as well tell you, I suppose. You appear to be hearing it from other sources. Your father has been the originator this spring of a very successful corner in wheat. He is, as you know, a keen judge of markets; and foreseeing that wheat for a number of reasons was likely to be scarce, he and one or two of his friends have purchased the whole of the visible supply. As Italy has had to import more than usual, and pay for it in gold when she hasn't much paper at her command, you can readily see that it places her in an awkward position. America is a great country, Marcia, when a single one of her citizens can bankrupt a whole kingdom."
"You don't mean, Uncle Howard," she cried, aghast, "that my father has caused the wheat famine?"
"There may be one or two minor causes, but I think he is deserving of most of the credit. The name of Copley, I assure you, is not beloved in Italy just now."
"And that is what the boys meant when they shouted 'Grano.'"
"Oh, it's no secret. We're celebrities in our small way. 2 continents are ringing with the name of the American Wheat King, and we come in for a share of his fame. When you think about it," he added, "there is something beautifully fitting about our taking Villa Vivalanti this spring. We appear to be the American editions of the Bad Prince. I fancy the old gentleman turned in his grave and smiled a trifle when I signed the lease."
"But, Uncle Howard, he doesn't understand. He does it like a mathematical problem, just to show what he can do, just for the pleasure of winning. Why don't you write to him? Why didn't you tell him?"
"Tell him?" Copley laughed. "You have not been acquainted with your father for so many years as I have, Marcia. Why should he care for a lot of Italian peasants? There are too many of them in existence already. The food in this world has to be fought for, and those who are beaten deserve to die."
Marcia's face turned white as the meaning of the 100 petty incidents flashed through her mind that before had had no significance. She knew now why the people in Rome had stopped talking about the wheat famine when she entered the room. She understood Sybert's attitude toward her all the year, his quizzical expression once or twice when she spent money over lavishly. She recalled the newspaper the workmen in Rome had thrust in her face, the grido del popolo, the cry of the people. She did not have to ask now what it meant. The very beggars in the street had known of her shame, while she alone was ignorant. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried.
"I did not wish to spoil your pleasure. There is no reason why you shouldn't be happy. If all goes well, a year from now you will be one of the notable heiresses of America. I only hope, when you're enjoying your wealth, that you'll not think of the poor starving wretches in Italy who gave it to you." Copley's tone was as brutal as his words. He had forgotten the girl before him. He was talking to the man in America. Marcia turned away and, with a deep sob, sank down by the table and buried her face in her arms. Sybert threw up his head quickly with a glance of anger, and Copley suddenly came to his senses. He sprang forward and laid his hand on her shoulder. "For heaven's sake, Marcia, don't cry about it. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm nervous and excited and worried. It isn't as bad as I told you." Marcia had a pitiable sense that she was acting like a child when, of all times, she ought to be calm and think. But the sudden revulsion of feeling had swept her away. She had indeed been living in a fool's paradise the past few months. The poor people Sybert had told her of yesterday, the starving thousands in Naples, her own father was the cause. And the peasants of Castel Vivalanti. No wonder they hated her. While she distributed chocolate with such graceful condescension, her father was taking away their bread. She thought over her uncle's words, and then, as she realized their content, she suddenly rose and faced the two men. "Uncle Howard," she said, "I think you've done very wrong not to tell me this before. I had a right to know, and I could have helped it. My father loves his business, but he loves me better. It's true, as I say, he's just doing it as a sort of problem. He doesn't see the suffering he causes, and he doesn't really believe there is any. Of course he knows that some people lose when he gains, but he thinks that they go into it with their eyes open, and that they must accept the chances of war. He's exactly as good a man as either of you." And then, as a sudden recollection flashed across her, she whirled about towards Sybert, her glance divided between indignation and contempt. "And you called me the Wheat Princess before every one in Paul Dessart's studio. You knew that it wasn't my fault. You knew that I didn't even know about the trouble, and you laughed when I told the story of the Vivalanti ghost." Her voice broke slightly, and, turning her back, she drew a piece of paper toward her on the table and began to write. "There," she said, holding out a scrawled sheet toward her uncle. "There is a cablegram. Please see that it is sent immediately." Copley ran his eyes over it in silence, and his mouth twitched involuntarily into a smile. "Well, Marcia, I'll see that it goes. I don't know, it may do some good, after all." He paused awkwardly a moment and held out his hand. "Am I forgiven?" he asked. "I shouldn't have said anything against your father, but he's my brother, remember, and while I abuse him myself, I wouldn't let an outsider do it. You are right. He doesn't know what he is doing. You must forget what I said. I have thought about it too much. Everyone in Italy believes that I have an interest in the deal, and when I am doing my best to help things along, It is a little hard, you know, to be accused, by the very people I am giving to, of being the cause of their distress."
"Yes, Uncle Howard, I understand. I don't blame you," she returned with a note of weariness in her voice. "But papa is really the kindest man in the world."
"Ah, Marcia, a very kind-hearted man nowadays can do a great deal of harm by telegraph without having to witness the results."
Sybert crossed the room toward her with a curious deep look in his eyes. He half held out his hand, but Marcia turned away without appearing to notice, and picking up her uncle's cheque book from the table, she tore out a leaf and scrawled across the face. "There's some money for the Relief Committee," she said, as she tossed the slip of paper across the table toward him. "That's all I have in the bank just at present, but I will give some more as soon as I get it." Sybert's face was equally impassive as he glanced from the paper back to her.
13,000 lire is a good deal. Do you think you ought—"
"I do as I please with my own money. This is my own," she added in parenthesis. "My mother left it to me."
"As you please," he returned, pocketing the slip with a half shrug. "I know a village in Calabria that will be very grateful for a little help until the olives ripen again." "Dinner is served," announced Pietro in the doorway.
Marcia nodded to the two men. "I don't want any dinner to night," and she turned upstairs to her room. She sat for half an hour staring out at the darkening Campagna. Then she rose and lighted the candles, and commenced a letter to her father. Her pen she dipped in blood. She told him everything she had heard or seen or imagined about Italy, of the hunger madness in the north and the starving peasants in the south, of the poor people of Castel Vivalanti and little Gervasio. She told him what the people said about her uncle, that they called her the Wheat Princess, and that the children in the streets taunted her as she went past. She told him that the name of Copley was despised from end to end of Italy. All the crimes that had ever been laid at the door of the government and the church and the ignorance of the people, Marcia heaped upon her offending father's shoulders, but with the forgiving assurance that she knew he didn't mean it. And would he please prove that he didn't mean it by stopping the corner immediately and sending wheat to Italy? It was a letter to wring a father's heart and a financier's. End of chapter 16. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 17 of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For the next week or so Marcia steadfastly avoided meeting people. There were no visitors at the villa, and it was easy to find pretexts for not going into Rome. She felt an overwhelming reluctance to meeting any of her friends, to meeting anyone, in truth, who even knew her name. It seemed to her that beneath their smiles and pleasant speeches she could read their thoughts, that the words wheat, wheat, wheat rang as an undertone to every sentence that was spoken. Her horseback rides were ridden in the direction away from Castel Vivalanti, and if by chance she did meet any of her former friends, the villagers, she galloped fast, looking the other way. Mrs. Copley was engaged with preparations for the coming ball. It was to be partially in honour of the Roystons, partially in honour of Marcia's birthday, and all of Rome, or as much of it existed for the Copleys, was to be asked to stop the night either at Villa Vivalanti or at the contessa's villa in Tivoli. Marcia, her aunt complained, showed an inordinate lack of interest in these absorbing preparations. She was usually ready enough with suggestions, and her listlessness did not pass unnoticed. Mr. Copley's eyes occasionally rested upon her with a guiltily worried expression, and if she caught the look she immediately assumed an air of gaiety. Neither had made the slightest reference to the subject of that evening's scene, except upon the arrival of a characteristic cablegram from Willard Copley, in which he informed his daughter that he was sending her a transport of wheat as a birthday present. "You see, Uncle Howard," she had said as she handed him the message, "it is possible to do good as well as harm by telegraph." Copley read it with a slight smile. "After all, I'm afraid he's no worse than the rest of us." And with that, wheat was a tabooed subject. For the future, however, he was particularly thoughtful toward his niece to show that he was sorry, and she met his advances more than half-way to show that she had forgiven. And all in all, they came to a better understanding because of their momentary falling out. Mrs. Copley accounted for Marcia's apathy
and possibly nearest the truth, on the ground that she had taken a touch of malaria in the old wine cellar, and she dosed her with quinine until the poor girl's head rang. It happened, therefore, that when the evening came to attend a musicale at the Contessa Torrenieri's villa, Marcia could very gracefully decline. The occasion of the function was the count's return from the Riviera, and although Marcia had some little curiosity in regard to the count, still it did not mount to such proportions that she was ready to face the rest of the world for its sake. Tivoli and Villa Torrenieri were a long 9 miles away, and Villa Vivalanti that evening dined earlier than usual. As Marcia came downstairs in response to Pietro's summons, she paused a moment on the landing. She had caught the sound of Sybert's low voice in the salon. She had not seen him since the tempestuous ending of the San Marco festa, and she had not yet determined on just what footing their relations were. She stood hesitating, with a very slight quickening of the pulse, and then with a decided thrill of annoyance, as an explanation for his unexpected visit presented itself. He had returned from Naples and come out to Villa Vivalanti for the purpose of attending the contessa's musicale. Marcia went on downstairs, more slowly, and entered the salon with a none too cordial air. Sybert's own greeting was his usual vein of polite indifference. His manner contained not the slightest suggestion of any misunderstanding in the past. It transpired that he knew nothing of the impending party. He was clothed in an unpretentious dinner jacket. But he expressed his willingness to attend, in spite of the lack of invitation. It was doubtless waiting for him in Naples, he declared, provided his host would lend him a coat. His host grumblingly assented, and Sybert inquired, with a glance from Mrs. Copley's velvet and jewels to Marcia's simple white woollen gown, what time they were planning to start. "About 8. It takes almost 2 hours to get there," said Mrs. Copley. "Marcia is not going," she added. "Why not, Miss Marcia?" She looked a trifle self-conscious as she put forth her excuse. "I've been having a little touch of malaria, and Aunt Catherine thought perhaps the night air——" "I remember when I was a boy in school, I used frequently to have headaches on Monday mornings," said Sybert, with a show of sympathy. Marcia sat in her room till she heard the carriage drive away, then she dragged a wicker chair out to the balcony which overlooked the eastern hills, already darkened into silhouettes against the sky. She sat leaning back with her hands clasped in her lap, watching the outlines of the old monastery fade into the night. She thought of the pale young monk with his questioning eyes, and wondered what sort of troubles people who lived in monasteries had. They were at least not her troubles, she smiled, and she thought of Paul Dessart. Suddenly she leaned over the railing and sniffed the light breeze as it floated up from the garden. Mingled with the sweet scent of lilies and oleanders was the heavy odour of a cigar. Her pulses suddenly quickened. She pushed her chair back and rose with an impatient movement. Pietro was holding a rendezvous with his friends again, and entertaining them with her uncle's tobacco. The night was chilly and she was cold. She turned into the dark room with a little laugh at herself. She was staying away from the contessa's musicale to avoid the night air? She groped about the table for a book and started downstairs with the half-hearted intention of reading out the evening in the salon. A wood fire had been kindled that afternoon, to dispel the slight dampness which the stone walls seemed to exude at the slightest suggestion of an eastern wind. It had burned low now, and the embers gave out a slight glow which was not obliterated by the 2 flickering candles on the table. Pietro's frugal soul evidently looked upon the lamp as unnecessary when Mr. and Mrs. Copley were away. Marcia piled on more sticks, with a shake of her head at Italian servants. The one thing in the world that they cannot learn is to build a fire, generations of economy having ingrained within them a notion that fuel is too precious to burn. The blaze once more started. Instead of ringing for a lamp and settling down to her book, she dropped into a chair and sat lazily watching the flames. Italy had got its hold upon her, with its spell of Lethean inertia. She wished only to close her eyes and drift idly with the current. Presently she heard the outer door open and close, and steps across the hall. She looked up with a start to see Laurence Sybert in the doorway. "What's the matter? Did I surprise you?" he inquired. "Yes. I thought you had gone to the party." "I was in the wine cellar just as much as you," he returned, with a little laugh, as he drew up a chair beside her. "Why can't I have malaria too?" His sudden appearance had been disconcerting, and her usual self-assurance seemed to be wandering to-night. She did not know what to say, and she half rose. "I was just going to ring for the lamp when you came. Pietro must have forgotten. Would you mind?" Sybert glanced lazily across the room at the bell. "Oh, sit still. We have light enough to talk by. And you surely aren't intending to read when you have a guest?" He stretched out his hand and took possession of her book. "I don't flatter myself that you stayed away from the contessa's to talk to me," she returned as she leaned back again with a slight shrug. "Why else should I have stayed?" he inquired. "Do you think, when it came to the point, your uncle wouldn't give me a coat?" "Probably you found that it didn't fit." Sybert laughed. "No, Miss Marcia, I didn't even try. I stayed because I wanted to talk with you." She let the statement pass in silence, and Sybert addressed himself to a careful rearrangement of the burning wood. When he finally laid down the tongs he remarked in a casual tone, "I owe you an apology. Will you accept it?" "What for?" "You appear to have several counts against me. Suppose we don't go into details. I offer a collective apology." "Because you called me the Wheat Princess? Oh yes, I'll excuse it. I dare say you were justified." He leaned forward with a slight frown. "Certainly I was not justified. It was neither kind nor gentlemanly, and I am sorry that I said it. I can only promise to have better manners in the future." Marcia dismissed the subject with a gesture. "Let me tell you about the good your money has done." "No, please don't. I don't want to hear. I know that it's horrible, and that you did the best with it possible. I'm glad if it helped. My father is sending some wheat that will be here in a few weeks." "Miss Marcia," he said slowly, "I wish you wouldn't take this matter so badly. Your uncle was out of his senses when he talked to you, and he didn't realize what he was saying. He feels awfully cut up about it. He told me to-night that he was afraid he had spoiled your summer, and that he wouldn't have hurt you for the world." Marcia's eyes suddenly filled with tears, and she bit her lip. Sybert leaned forward and poked the fire. "I should like to talk to you about your uncle," he said, with his eyes fixed on the embers. "He is one of the finest men I have ever known. And it is not often that a man in his position amounts to much, that is, as a human being. The temptations are all the other way. Most men, you know, with leisure and his tastes would, well, go in for collecting carved ivory and hammered silver and all that rubbish. Nobody understands what he is trying to do, least of all the people he is doing it for. He does it very quietly and in his own way, and he doesn't ask for thanks. Still, just a little appreciation would be grateful, and instead of that he is abused at every turn. This wheat business increased the feeling against him, and naturally he feels sore. The other evening he'd just been reading some articles about the trouble in a Roman paper, and I had been telling him about your encounter with the village people when you came in. It was an unfortunate moment you chose, and he forgot himself. I wish you would be as kind to him as you can, for he has a good many critics outside, and—" Sybert hesitated an instant. "He needs a little sympathy at home." Marcia drew a deep breath. "I understand about Uncle Howard," she said. "I used to think sometimes," she hesitated too, "that he wasn't very happy, but I didn't know the reason. Of course I don't blame him for what he said. I know he was worried, and I know he didn't mean it. In any case, I should rather know the truth. But about the wheat," she continued, "my father is not to blame the way you think he is. He and Uncle Howard don't understand each other, but I understand them both, and if I had known sooner I could have stopped it. He didn't have the remotest idea of harming Italy or any other country. He just thought about getting ahead of a lot of others, and—you know what men are like, making people look up to him. He's very quick. He sees things faster than other men. He knows what's going to happen ahead of time, and you can't expect him not to take advantage of it. Of course," she flushed, "he wants to make money, too. But it isn't all that, for he doesn't use it after he gets it made. It's the beating others that he likes, the power it gives him. I'm afraid," she added, with a slightly pathetic smile, "that I shall have to go home and look after him." "Oh, certainly, Miss Marcia, we all know that your father had no thought of deliberately harming Italy or any other country. And, as a matter of fact, the American wheat corner has not had so much to do with the trouble as the Italian government would have us believe. The simple truth is that your father has been used as a scapegoat. While the Roman papers have been suggestively silent on many points, they have had much to say of the American wheat king." "Have the things they said been very bad?" Sybert smiled a trifle. "There's not been much, to tell the truth, that he will care to cut out and paste in his scrap-book." "Our party next week seems heartless, doesn't it? Sort of like giving a ball while the people next door are having a funeral. I wanted to give it up, but Uncle Howard looked so hurt when I proposed it that I didn't say anything more about it." "No, certainly not. That would be foolish and useless. Because some people have to be unhappy is no reason why all should be." "I suppose not," she agreed slowly, and then she added, "The world used to be so much pleasanter to live in before I knew there was any misery in it. I wish I didn't have to know. Miss Marcia, I told you the other day that it was a relief sometimes to see people who are thoroughly, irresponsibly happy, who dance over the pit without knowing it's there. A man who has been in the pit, who knows all its horrors, who feels as if he reeked with them, likes occasionally to see some one who doesn't even know of its existence. And yet in the end do you think he can thoroughly respect such blindness? Don't you feel that you are happier in a worthier sense when you look at life with your eyes open, when you honestly take the bad along with the good?" She sat silent for a few minutes, apparently considering his words. Presently he added, "As for your party, I think you may dance with a free conscience. You've done what you could to help matters on, and you'll do a great deal more in the future." "I'm afraid that my conscience didn't have much to do with wanting to give up the ball," she acknowledged, with a slightly guilty laugh. "It's simply that I can't bear to meet people, and feel that all the time they're talking to me they're calling me in their minds the Wheat Princess." "That, I suppose you know, is very silly. It's the price you have to pay, and I haven't much sympathy to offer. However, you need not let it bother you, for, as a matter of fact, there will not be many men here who would not be wheat kings themselves if they had the chance, even knowing beforehand all the suffering it was going to bring to this trouble-ridden country. And now, suppose we don't talk about wheat any more. You've thought about it a good deal too much." "You're not very optimistic," she said. "Oh, well, I'm not blind. It takes an Italian to be optimistic in this country." "Do you like the Italians, or don't you?" she asked. "Sometimes you seem to, and sometimes you act as if you despised them." "Yes, certainly I like them. I was born in Italy." "But you're an American," she said quickly. He laughed at her tone. "You surely want to be an American?" she insisted. "As Henry James says, Miss Marcia, one's country, like one's grandmother, is antecedent to choice." She studied the fire for some time without speaking, and Sybert, leaning back lazily, studied her. Her next observation surprised him. "You said the other day, Mr. Sybert, that every man lived for some idea, and I've been wondering what yours was." A curious expression flashed over his face. "You couldn't expect me to tell. I'm a diplomatist." "I have an idea that it is not very much connected with diplomacy." "In which case it would be poor diplomacy for me to give it away." "Mr. Sybert, you give a person a queer impression, as if you were acting a part all the time, and didn't want people to know what you were really like." "An anarchist must be careful. The police—" "I believe you are one!" she cried. "Don't be alarmed. I assure you I am not. But," he added, with a little flash of fire, "I swear in a country like this one would like to be. Anything for action. Oh, I'm not a fool," he added, in response to her smile. "We're living in the 19th century, and not in the 13th. Anarchy belongs to the Dark Ages as much as feudalism." "You're so difficult to place. I like to know whether people are Democrats or Republicans, and whether they are Presbyterians or Episcopalians. Then one always knows where to find them, and is not in danger of hurting their feelings." "I'm afraid I can't claim any such respectable connections as those," Sybert laughed. "Half the time one would think you were a Catholic by the way you stand up for the priests, the other half one would think you weren't anything by the way you abuse them." This mania for classifying! What difference if a person calls himself a Catholic or a Baptist, a Unitarian or a Buddhist? It's all one. A man is not necessarily irreligious because he doesn't subscribe to any cut-and-dried formulae."
"Mr. Sybert," she dared, "I used to be terribly suspicious of you. I knew you weren't just the way you appeared, and I thought you were really rather bad. But I'm beginning to believe you're unusually good."
"Oh, I say, Miss Marcia, what are you trying to get at? Do you want me to confess to a hair shirt underneath my dinner jacket? I am afraid you must leave that to our friend the monk, up on his mountain top."
"No, I didn't mean just that. Flagellations and hair shirts strike me as a pretty useless sort of goodness."
"It does seem a poor business," he agreed, "for a strong young fellow like that to give up his whole life to the work of getting his soul into paradise."
"Still, if he wants paradise that much, and is willing to make the sacrifice——"
"It's setting a pretty high value on his own soul. I should never rate mine as being worth a lifetime of effort."
"I suppose a person's soul is worth whatever price he chooses to set."
"Oh, of course, if a man keeps his soul in a bandbox he can produce it immaculate in the end. But what's a soul for if it's not for use? He would much better live in the world with his fellow men, and help them keep their souls clean, even at the risk of getting his own a little dusty."
"Yes, perhaps that's true," she conceded. "Such dust will doubtless brush off in the end."
"It certainly ought, if things are managed right."
"I can't help feeling sorry, though, for the poor young monk. He will be so disappointed, when he brings out his shiny new soul, to find that it doesn't rank any higher than some of the dusty ones that have been dragged through the world."
"It will serve him right," Sybert declared. "He ought to have been thinking of other people's soul instead of his own."
"'Tis a dangerous thing to play with souls, and matter enough to save one's own," quoted Marcia.
"Oh, well," he shrugged, "I won't argue, with the poet and the priest both against me, but still——"
"You think that your speckled soul is exactly as good as other people's white souls?"
"It all depends," he demurred, "upon how they kept theirs white and how I got mine speckled."
"Our freight has afforded a long moral," she laughed.
"Ah, and I suspect he didn't deserve it. He looks, poor devil, as if his heart were still in the world, in spite of the fact that he himself is in the cloister."
"In that case," she returned, "he's lost the world for nothing, for his prayers will not be answered unless his heart is in them."
"There's a tragedy," said Sybert, "to have lost the world, and then, in spite of it, to turn up in the end with a dusty soul." They looked at each other soberly, and then they both laughed.
"Philosophy is a queer thing," said Marcia. "You may go as far as you please, but you always end where you started." "Bubbles that glitter as they rise, and break on vain Philosophy's eye-bubbling spring," he repeated softly, with his eyes on the fire. And then he leaned toward her and laughed again. "Miss Marcia, do you know, I have an idea." "What is it?" she asked.
"It's about you and me. I have a theory that we might be pretty good friends."
"I thought we'd been friends for some time," she returned evasively. "I am sure my uncle's friends are mine."
"Really? I hadn't suspected it. But it's the same with friends as with politics and religion. They don't amount to much until you find them for yourself." She considered this in silence. "I should say," he added, "that we've been pretty good enemies all this time. What do you say to our being friends for a change?" Marcia glanced away in a sudden spasm of shyness. "Shall we try it?" he asked in a low tone, bending toward her and laying his hand palm upward on the arm of her chair. She dropped her hand into his hesitatingly, and his fingers closed upon it. He looked at the fire a moment, and then back at her face. "Marcia," he said softly, "did you ever hear the Tuscan proverb, 'The foes of yesterday become the friends of to-day, and the lovers of to-morrow'?" A quick wave of colour swept over her face, and a faint answering flush appeared in his. She drew her hand away and rose to her feet, with a light laugh that put the last few minutes ages away. "I'm afraid it's getting late, and Aunt Catherine would be scandalized if she found her malaria patient waiting up for her. I will leave you to smoke in peace." Sybert rose and followed her into the hall. He chose a tall brass candlestick from the row on the chimney-piece, lighted it, and handed it to her with a silent bow. "Thank you," said Marcia, with a brief glance at his face. She paused on the landing and looked down. He was standing on the rug at the foot of the stairs, watching her with an amused smile. "Buona notte, Signor Siberti," she murmured. "Buona notte, signorina," he returned with a little laugh. "Pleasant dreams." Chapter 18 of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Shall I do it high or low, ma'am?" Marcia, who was sitting before the mirror in a lace camisole, fidgeted impatiently. "Oh, do it any way you please, Granton, only hurry. Low, I think. That will look best with my gown. But do be quick about it. I have to go downstairs." "There's plenty of time," replied the maid imperturbably. "But I would be a little faster if you would kindly sit still." "Very well, Granton, I won't move for 5 minutes. I'm really getting excited, though, and I didn't care a bit for the party until it began. Yes, ma'am, if you'll just turn your head a little more this way. It's very early." "I know, but I have to go down and be sure that Pietro understands about the lights. He's so stupid, he has to be watched every minute. And, Granton, as soon as you get through with Mrs. Copley, please go and help Bianca dress Miss Royston. Bianca doesn't know anything more about fixing hair than a rabbit." Granton's silence breathed acquiescence in this statement, and, under impulse of the implied compliment, she became more sprightly in her movements as she skilfully twisted Marcia's yellow-brown hair into a seemingly simple coil at the nape of her neck. For the past 3 days the house had been full of guests, and though Marcia had been somewhat cold in her anticipations of the time, she found herself thoroughly enjoying it when it came. The days had been filled with rides and drives and impromptu gaiety. Paul Dessart had been master of the revels, and he filled the office brilliantly. He had supplied the leaven of fun on every occasion, and had been so thoroughly tactful that his host and hostess had gratefully blessed him, and Marcia had cast him more than one involuntary glance of approval. And this was her birthday and the night of the ball. All day long she had been the centre of a congratulatory group, the recipient of prettily worded felicitations, and she not unnaturally found it pleasant. The afternoon train had brought still more guests from Rome, and Villa Vivalanti's 19 bedrooms were none too many. 5 o'clock tea on the terrace had itself been in the nature of a festa, with gaily dressed groups coming in and going amid the sound of laughter and low voices, while the excitable Italian servants scurried to and fro, placing tea-tables and carrying cups. Marcia had been secretly disappointed that afternoon by the non-arrival of one guest whom she half expected, and Eleanor Royston had been frankly so. "Mr. Copley," Eleanor had inquired of her host, as he offered her a cup of tea, "where's that friend of yours, Mr. Laurence Sybert?" "Quelling rioters, I presume. It's more in his line just now than attending balls." "As if anything could be more in a diplomat's line than attending balls. With all the other diplomats here and off their guard, it's just the time to learn state secrets. And he's the most interesting man in Rome," she complained. "I wanted to add him to my collection." "Your collection?" Mr. Copley's startled expression approached a stare. "Of interesting men," she explained. "Oh, don't be alarmed. I don't scalp them. The collection is purely mental. It's small enough, so far, to be carried in my head. It's merely that I am a student of human nature, and am constantly on the alert for fresh specimens. Your Mr. Sybert is puzzling. I don't know just how to classify him." "Ah, I see. It is merely a scientific interest you take in him." Mr. Copley's tone was one of relief. "If I can be of any assistance with the label, I am sure that he would feel honoured to grace your collection." "I am not so sure," said Marcia. "Wait till you hear the others, Uncle Howard. A Kansas politician who wants to be a poet, an engineer on the Claytons' yacht, a Russian prince who talks 7 languages and can't express his thoughts in any, and who were the others, Eleanor? Oh, yes, the blacksmith, who married the maid and beats her." "You don't do them justice," Eleanor remonstrated. "Those are merely their accidental, extrinsic qualities. That which makes them interesting is something intrinsic." Mr. Copley shot her an amused glance, and drawing up a chair, sat down beside her, prepared to argue it out. "The list has possibilities, Miss Royston," he assured her, "though of course one can't judge without knowing the gentleman personally. With which one, may I ask, are you going to classify Mr. Sybert?" "Oh, in a separate pigeon hole by himself. That is just what makes my collection interesting." It was evidently a subject that she discussed with some relish. "Most men, you know, you look them over and immediately assign them to a group with a lot of others; but once in a while you come across a man who goes entirely by himself, is what the French call an original, and he is worth studying." Mr. Copley took out a cigarette and regarded it speculatively. "I see," he said. "The best study of mankind is man. And so you think Sybert a specimen who deserves a pigeon hole by himself?" "Yes, I think he does, though I haven't quite decided on the whole yet. That's why it worries me that he didn't come to the party. One hates to leave these little matters unsolved." "I am sincerely sorry for you to have lost the opportunity. I must tell him your opinion." "No, indeed," remonstrated Eleanor. "I may meet him again some day, and if you tell him I shall never learn the truth. One's only chance is to catch them unawares." "You're a very penetrating person, Miss Royston." "I've been out 9 seasons," she laughed. "You can trust me to know a man when I see one." "I wish you'd teach Marcia some of your lore," he murmured, as he turned toward the loggia to greet a fresh carriage full of guests. Even though one man were missing, still a great many others were there, and it had only been an undercurrent of Marcia's consciousness in any case that had considered the matter. The laughter and babble of voices, the gay preparations and hurrying servants had had their effect. As Granton clasped about her neck Mr. Copley's expiatory gift, a copy of an old Etruscan necklace in pearls and uncut emeralds set in hammered gold, she was as pleasurably excited as a young woman may legitimately be on the eve of a birthday ball. "There, Granton, that's all," she cried, catching up her very Parisian skirts and flying for the door. "Hurry with the others, please, for it won't be long before the guests begin coming." She started downstairs, pulling on her gloves as she went. She paused a moment on the landing to view the scene below, and she blinked once or twice as it dawned upon her that Laurence Sybert was standing at the foot of the stairs watching her, just as he had stood the last time she had seen him when he bade her good night. For a moment she felt an absurd tremor run through her, and then, with something like a gulp, she collected herself and went on down to greet him. "Mr. Sybert, we were afraid you weren't coming. When did you get here?" "On the late train. I have been in the South, and I didn't get back to the city till this afternoon." "Your arrivals are always so spectacular," she said. "We entirely give you up, and then the first thing we know you are quietly standing before us on the rug." "I should call that the reverse of spectacular." "Have you seen Uncle Howard? Did they find any place to put you? The house is cram full." "Oh yes, I've been officially welcomed. I have a bed in your uncle's dressing-room." "You may be thankful for that. The next comer, I am afraid, will be put in the cellar." Sybert did not choose to prolong these amenities of welcome any further, and he stood quietly watching her while she buttoned her gloves. She looked very radiant to-night, with the candlelight gleaming on her hair and her hazel eyes shining with excitement. Her gown was the filmiest shimmering white with an undertone of green. About her neck the pearls gleamed whitely, each separate jewel a pulsing globe of light. Marcia glanced up and touched the necklace with her hand. "This is Uncle Howard's birthday present," she said. "Isn't it lovely? It's a copy of an old necklace in Castellani's collection. My uncle gives me pearls, and my father is sending wheat." She turned aside into the long salon, and Sybert followed her. If Marcia had been momentarily jostled from her self-possession by his sudden appearance, she had completely regained her poise. She was buoyantly at her ease again. There was a touch of intimacy, almost of coquetry, about her manner as she talked, and yet Sybert noted the fact with a sub-smile of comprehension. She avoided crossing eyes with him. That moment by the fireside was still too vivid. They returned to the hall, and Marcia stepped to the door leading on to the loggia. The cornice was outlined with tiny coloured lamps, while a man was lighting others by the terrace balustrade. She glanced back at Sybert, who was standing still in the hall. "You aren't going out?" he asked. "Just a moment. I want to see how it looks." He looked at her bare shoulders with a slight frown. "Bring the signorina a wrap," he said to the servant at the door. "I don't need a wrap," said Marcia. "It's a warm night." Sybert shook his head with an expression that was familiar. "Oh, if you wish to say anything, say it," she cried. "Only please don't look at me with that smile. It's the way you looked the first time I saw you, and I don't like it." "I have nothing to say. When a young woman threatened with malaria proposes to go out into an Italian night bare-shouldered, a mere man is left speechless." "Pride would keep me warm." "I haven't a doubt of it. But in case it should for the moment fail—" He took the long white cloak from the man's arm and glanced at it with another expression as he placed it on her shoulders. It was composed mostly of chiffon and lace. "All is vanity that comes from a Paris shop," laughed Marcia. Sybert lit a cigarette and followed her. "Well?" he asked, as they paused by the terrace balustrade. "Does it meet with your approval?" "It's lovely, isn't it?" she replied as she looked back at the broad white façade with its gleaming windows. There was no moon, but a clear, star-sprinkled sky. In all the dark landscape the villa alone was a throbbing centre of life and light. Rows of coloured lanterns were beginning to outline the avenue leading to the gate, and in the ilex grove tiny red and blue and white bulbs glowed among the branches, like the blossoms of some tropical night-blooming cereus. Servants were hurrying past the windows, musicians were commencing to tune their instruments, everywhere was the excitement of preparation. "And this is your birthday," he said. "I suppose you have received many pretty speeches to day, Miss Marcia. I hope they may all come true." She glanced up in his face, and he looked down with a smile. 23 is a great age. A shadow flitted across her face. "Isn't it?" she sighed. "I thought 22 was bad enough, but 23! It won't be many years before I'd be really getting old." Sybert laughed. "It's been a long time since I saw 23. When I first came back to Rome." 12 years," said Marcia. "It's an easy enough problem if you care to work it out. I don't care to, any more." "It's not bad for a man," she said, "but a woman grows old so young." "You need not worry over that just now. The grey hairs will not come for some time yet." "I'm not worrying," she laughed. "I was just thinking. It isn't nice to grow old, is it?" "Certainly not. It's the great tragedy of life, and it comes to all, Miss Marcia, to you as well as to the poorest peasant girl in Castel Vivalanti. Life, after all, contains some justice." Marcia turned her back to the shining villa and looked down over the great Campagna stretching away darkly under the stars, with here and there the gleam of a shepherd's fire, built to ward off the poison in the air. "Things are not very just," she said slowly. "Not very," he agreed. "And one has little faith that they ever will be, either in this world or the next." "It would be comfortable, wouldn't it, if you could only believe that people are unfortunate as a punishment, because they deserve to be?" "It would be a beautiful belief, but one which you can scarcely hold in Italy." "Poor Italy!" she sighed. "Ah, poor Italy!" he echoed. With a sudden motion he threw away his cigarette over the balustrade and immediately lit another. Marcia watched his face in the flare of the match. The eyes seemed deeper set than usual, the jaw more boldly marked, and there were nervous lines about the mouth. His face seemed to have grown thinner in the last few weeks. They turned away and sauntered toward the ilex grove. "There are, however, compensations," he went on presently. "Our poor peasants do not have all the pleasures, but they do not have all the pains either. There are a great many girls in Castel Vivalanti who will never have a birthday ball." He glanced from the lighted villa behind them to the glowing vista in front, the green stretch of the ilex walk with the shimmering fountain at the end, whose lives will be very bare indeed. They will work and eat and sleep, and love and perhaps hate, and that is all. You have many other pleasures which they could never understand. You enjoy the egoist, for instance. But also," he paused, "you can suffer many things they cannot understand. You are an individual, while they are merely human beings. Gervasio's stepmother married a husband, and doubtless loved him very much and cried for him a week after he was dead. Then she married another, and saw no difference between him and the first. She may have to work hard, and she may be hungry sometimes, but she will escape the worst suffering in life, which you, with all your privileges, may not escape, Marcia." "One would rather not escape it," she answered. "I should rather feel what there is to feel." "Ah," he breathed, "so should we all. And these poor devils of peasants, who can't feel anything but their hunger and weariness, lose the most of life. They are not even human beings; they are merely beasts of burden, hard-working, patient, unthinking oxen, who go the way they are driven, not dreaming of their strength. That is the unfairness; that is where society owes them a debt. They have no chance to develop. However," he broke off with a short laugh, "it's not the time to bother you with other people's troubles, on your birthday night. We will hope, after all, that you may not have any very grave ones of your own." They had reached the fountain, and they paused. They were alone in a fairy grove, with a nightingale pouring out his soul in the branches above their heads. Marcia stood looking down the dim, green alley they had come by, breathing deeply. She knew that Sybert's eyes were on her, and slowly she raised her head and looked up in his face. For a moment they stood in silence. Then, as the sound of carriage wheels reached them from the avenue, she started and turned away. "The people are beginning to come. I am afraid that Aunt Catherine will be wondering where I am," she said in a voice that trembled slightly. Sybert followed her in silence. Some one had once said to her that Sybert's silences meant more than other men's words, and as they turned back she tried to think who it had been. Ah, she remembered. It was the Contessa. End of chapter 18. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 19 of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Throughout the evening, while she was laughing and talking with the stream of guests, Marcia kept a subconscious notion of Sybert's movements. She saw him in the hall exchanging jokes with the English ambassador. She saw him talking to Eleanor Royston and bending over the Contessa Torrenieri. And once, as she whirled past in a waltz, she caught sight of his dark face in a doorway with his eyes fixed on her, and she forgave him Eleanor and the Contessa. She was conscious all the time of a secret amazement at herself. Sybert had suddenly become for her the only person in the room, and while she was outwardly intent upon what other men were saying, her mind was filled with the picture of his face as he had looked during that silent moment by the fountain. She went through the evening in a maze, conscious only of the approach of the one dance she had with him. When the evening was nearing its end, she was suddenly brought to her senses by the realization that she was strolling down one of the ilex walks with Paul Dessart at her side. She had been rattling on unheedingly, and she scarcely knew how they had come there. Her first instinct was one of self-preservation. She felt what was coming, and she wanted to ward it off. Anything to get back to the crowd again. She paused and looked back at the lighted villa, listening to the sound of the violins rising above the murmur of voices and laughter. For a moment she almost felt impelled to turn and run. Since she had stopped, Paul stopped perforce, and looked at her questioningly. I think we'd better go back," she stammered. "This dance is almost over, and—" "We won't go back just yet," he returned. "I want to talk to you. You owe me a few moments, Marcia. Come here and sit down, and listen to what I have to say." He turned into the little circle by the fountain and motioned toward a garden seat. Marcia dropped limply upon it and looked at him with an air of pleading. There was no circumlocution. Both knew that the time had come when everything must be said, and Paul went to the point. "Well, Marcia, are you going to marry me?" Marcia sat opening and shutting her fan nervously, trying to frame an answer that would not hurt him. "I've been patient. I haven't bothered you. You surely ought to know your own mind now. You've had a month. It hasn't been exactly a happy month for me. Tell me, please, Marcia. Don't keep me waiting any longer." "Oh, Paul," she said, looking back with half frightened eyes, "it's all a mistake." "A mistake? What do you mean? Marcia, I trusted you. You can't throw me over now. Tell me quickly." "Forgive me, Paul," she faltered miserably. I was mistaken. I thought, that day in the cloister—" He realized that, somehow, she was slipping away from him and that he must fight to get her back. He bent toward her and took her hand, with his glowing, eager face close to hers, his words coming so fast that he fairly stuttered. "Yes, that day in the cloister. You did care for me then, didn't you, Marcia? Just a little bit. You let me hope. You told me there wasn't any other man. You've been kind to me ever since. That's what I've lived on this whole month. The memory of that afternoon. Tell me what the trouble is. Don't let anything come between us. We've had such a happy spring. Let it keep on being happy. We've lived in Arcady, Marcia, you and I. Why should we ever leave it? Why must we go back? Why not go forward? If you cared that afternoon, you can care now. I haven't changed. Tell me why you hesitate. I don't want to force you to make up your mind, but this uncertainty is simply hell." Marcia listened, breathing fast, half carried away by the impetuous flow of his words. She sat watching him with troubled eyes and silent lips in a sort of stupor. She could not collect her thoughts sufficiently to answer him. What had she to say? She asked herself wildly. What could she say that was adequate? Paul, bending forward, his eyes close to hers, was waiting expectantly, insistently, for her to speak, when suddenly they were startled by a step on the gravel path before them, and they both looked up to see Laurence Sybert, cigarette in hand, stroll around the corner of the ilex walk. As his eye fell upon them he stopped like a man shot, and for a breathless instant the three faced one another. Then, with a quick rigidity of his whole figure, he bowed an apology and wheeled about. Marcia turned from red to white and snatched her hand away. Paul watched her a moment with an angry light growing in his eyes. "You are in love with Laurence Sybert," he whispered. Marcia shrank back in the corner and hid her face against the back of the seat. Paul bent over her. "Look at me!" he cried. "Tell me it's not true. You can't do it. You've been deceiving me. You've been lying. Oh, yes, I know you've been very careful not to make any promises in so many words, but you've made them in other ways, and I believed you. I've been fool enough to think you in earnest, and all the time you've been amusing yourself." Marcia raised her eyes to his. "Paul, I haven't. You are mistaken. I don't know how I've changed. I can't explain. That day in the cloister I thought I liked you very much, and if Margaret hadn't come in, perhaps I wouldn't have deceived you for a moment, and you know it." "Tell me you don't love Sybert." "Paul, you have no right." "I have no right. You said there was no one else, and I believed you, and now, when I ask for an explanation, you tell me to go about my business. I suppose you were beginning to get tired of me these last few days, and thought——" "You have no right to talk to me this way. I haven't meant to deceive you. You asked me if there were any one else, and I told you there was not, and it was true. I'm sorry to hurt you, but it's better to find it out now." Paul rose to his feet with a very hard laugh. "Oh, yes, decidedly it's better to find out now. It would have been still better if you had found it out sooner." He turned his back and kicked the coping of the fountain viciously. Marcia crossed over to him and touched him on the arm. "Paul," she said, "I can't let it end so. I know I have been very much to blame, but not as you think. I liked you so much." He turned and saw the tears in her eyes, and his anger vanished. "Oh, I know I've no business to speak so. But I'm naturally cut up, you know. Don't cry about it. You can't help it. If you don't love me, you don't, and that ends the matter. I'll get over it, Marcia." He smiled a trifle bleakly. "I'm not the fellow to sit down and cry when I can't have what I want. I've gone without things before." He offered her his arm. "We'll go back now. I'm afraid you're missing your dances." Marcia barely touched his arm, and they turned back without speaking. He led her into the hall, and bowing with his eyes on the floor, turned back out of doors. She laughed and chatted her way through 2 or 3 groups before she could reach the stairs and escape to her own room, where she locked the door and sank down on the floor by the couch. Trouble was beginning for her sooner than she had thought, and underneath the remorse and pity she felt for Paul, the thing that lay like lead on her heart was the look on Sybert's face as he turned away. A knock presently came on the door, followed by a rattling of the knob. "Marcia, Marcia!" called Eleanor Royston. "Are you in there?" Marcia raised her head and listened in silence. The knock came again. She rose and went to the door. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to come in. It's I, Eleanor. Open the door. Why don't you come down?" Marcia shook out her rumpled skirts, pushed back her hair, and opened the door. "Everybody's asking for you. The ambassador says you were engaged to him for a— Why, what's the matter?" Marcia drew back quickly into the shadow, and Eleanor stepped in and closed the door behind her. "What's the matter, child?" she inquired again. "You've been crying. Has Paul——" she asked suddenly. Eleanor's intuitive faculties were abnormally developed. "I suppose he was pretty nasty," she proceeded, taking Marcia's answer for granted. "He can be on occasion. But, to tell you the truth, I think he has some cause to be. I think you deserve all you got." Marcia sank into a chair with a gesture of weariness, and Eleanor walked about the room handling the ornaments. "Oh, I knew he was in love with you. There's nothing subtle about Paul. He wears his heart on his sleeve, if any one ever did. But if you don't mind my saying so, Marcia, I think you've been playing with rather a high hand. It's hardly legitimate, you know, to deliberately set out to make a man fall in love with you." "I haven't been playing. I didn't mean to." "Oh, nonsense! Men don't fall in love without a little encouragement. And I'm not blind. I've been watching you. If you want my honest opinion, I think you've been pretty unfair with Paul." "I know it," Marcia said miserably. "You can't blame me any worse than I blame myself. But you just can't love people if you don't." "I'm not blaming you for not loving him. It's for his loving you. That, by using a little foresight, might have been avoided. However, I don't know that I'm exactly the person to preach." Eleanor dropped into a chair with a short laugh, and leaned forward with her chin in her hand and her eyes on Marcia's face. "I have a theory, Marcia. It's more than a theory, it's a superstition, that some day we'll be paid in our own coin. I'm 28, and a good many men have thought they were in love with me, while I myself have never managed to fall in love with any of them. But I'm going to some day, hard, and then either he's not going to care about me, or something's going to be in the way so that we can't marry. It's going to be a tragedy. I know it as well as I know I'm sitting here. I'm going to pay for my 9 seasons, and with interest. It makes me reckless. The score is already so heavy against me that a few more items don't count. But I know my tragedy's coming, and the longer I put it off the worse it's going to be. It's a nice superstition. I'll share it with you, Marcia." Marcia smiled rather sorrily. It was not a superstition she cared to have thrust upon her just then. She was divining it for herself, and did not need Eleanor to put it into words. "As for Paul, you couldn't do anything else, of course. You're not fitted to each other for a moment, and you'll grow more unfitted every day. Paul needs some one who is more objective, who doesn't think too much, some one like Margaret, for instance. In the meantime, you needn't worry, he'll manage to survive it." She rose with another laugh and stood over Marcia's chair. "It's over and done with, and can't be helped. There's nothing to cry about. But mark my words, Marcia Copley, you'll be falling in love yourself some day, and then Paul will be avenged. Meanwhile there are several years before you in which you can have a very good time. Come on, we must go downstairs. The people will be leaving in a little while. Bathe your eyes, and I'll fix your hair." Marcia went downstairs and laughed and danced and talked again, and once she almost stopped in the middle of a speech to wonder how she could do it. It was finally with heartfelt thankfulness that she watched the people beginning to leave. Once, as she was bidding a group good night, she caught sight of Sybert in the hall bending over the contessa's hand. She covertly studied his face, but it was more darkly inscrutable than ever. She slipped upstairs as soon as the last carriage had rolled away. It was not until long after the sunlight had streamed into her windows, however, that she finally closed her eyes. Eleanor Royston's pleasant superstition she was pondering very earnestly. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Wheat Princess by Jean Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The ball ended, the guests gone, Villa Vivalanti forgot its one burst of gaiety, and settled down again to its usual state of peaceful somnolence. The days were growing warmer. White walls simmering in the sunshine, fragrant garden borders resonant with the hum of insects, the cool green of the ilex grove, the sleepy, slow drip of the fountain. It was all so beautifully Italian, and so very, very lonely. During the hot middays Marcia would sit by the ruins of the old villa, or pace the shady ilex walks with her feelings in a tumult. She had seen neither Paul Dessart nor Laurence Sybert since the evening of her birthday, and that moment by the fountain when the three had faced each other silently was not a pleasant memory. It was one, however, which recurred many times a day. Of Sybert Marcia heard no news whatsoever. In reply to her casual question as to when he would be at the villa again, her uncle had remarked that just at present Sybert had more important things to think of than taking a villeggiatura in the Sabine hills. But of Paul Dessart and the Roystons most unexpected news had come. Paul's father had had an attack brought on by overwork, and they were all of them going home. The letters were written on the train en route for Cherbourg, a long letter from Margaret, a short one from Eleanor. The latter afforded some food for reflection, but the reflection did not bring enlightenment. "Dear Marcia," it ran, "I am sorry not to see you again, and, to be quite frank, I am equally sorry not to have seen Mr. Sybert again. I feel that if I had had more time and half a chance, I might have accomplished something in the interests of science. Margaret told you, of course, that Paul is going back with us. We hope his father's illness isn't serious, but he preferred to go. There is nothing to keep him in Rome, he says. Poor fellow! You must write him a nice letter. Don't worry too much about him, though. He won't blow his brains out. I could tell you something. I have just the tiniest suggestion of a suspicion which, granted fair winds and a prosperous voyage, may arrive at the dignity of news by the time we reach the other side. However, you don't deserve to hear it, and I shan't tell. Have I aroused your curiosity sufficiently? If so, c'est tout. I shall hope to see you in Pittsburg this autumn. That, my dear Marcia, is merely a polite phrase, and is not strictly true. I shall hope, rather, to see you in Paris, or Rome, or Vienna. I am afraid I have the wander habit to the end. The world is too big for one to settle down permanently in one place, and that place Pittsburg, is it not so? One can never be happy for thinking of all the things that are happening in all of the places where one is not. Au revoir, then, till autumn. We'll play on the Champs-Élysées together. Eleanor. A letter had come also from Marcia's father, which put her in an uncomfortably unsettled frame of mind. It was written in the Copley vein of humorous appreciation of the situation, but, for all that, she could see underneath that she had hurt him. He disavowed all knowledge and culpability in the Triple Alliance and the Abyssinian War. He regretted the fact that the taxes were heavy, but he had had no hand in making up Italy's financial budget. As to wheat, there were many reasons why Italy could not afford it, aside from the fact that it was dear. Marcia could give what she wished to the peasants to make up for her erring father, and he enclosed a blank cheque to her order, surely an excessive sign of penitence on the part of a business man. The letter closed with the statement that he was lonely without her, and that she must come back to America next winter and keep her old father out of mischief. She read the last few sentences over twice, with a rising lump in her throat. It was true. Poor man, he must be lonely. She ought to have tried to take her mother's place, and to have made a home for him before now. Her duty suddenly presented itself very clearly, and it appeared as uninviting as duties usually do. A few months before she would not have minded, but now Italy had got its hold upon her. She did not wish to go. She wished only to sit in the sunshine, happy, unthinking, and let the days slip idly by. A picture flashed over her of what the American life would be. A brownstone house on Fifth Avenue in the winter, a country place in the Berkshires in the summer, an aunt of her mother's for chaperon, her father's friends, lawyers and bankers and brokers who talked railroads and the Stock Exchange. For interests she would have balls and receptions, literary clubs and charities. Marcia breathed a doleful sigh. Her memories of the New York house were dreary. It was not a life she cared to renew. But nothing of all this did she let her father know. She sent a gracefully forgiving letter, with the promise that she would come home for the winter, and not a hint that the home coming was not her own desire. It seemed that, things having once commenced to change, everything was going. Mr. Copley himself exploded the next bombshell. He came back from Rome one night with the announcement that the weather was getting pretty hot, and the family ought to leave next week for Switzerland. "Oh, Uncle Howard, not yet!" Marcia cried. "Let us wait until the end of June. It isn't too hot till then. Up here in the hills it's pleasant all summer. I don't want to leave the villa." "Rome is hot just now in more ways than one," he returned. "I'd feel safer to have you in Switzerland or up in the Tyrol during the excitement. Goodness only knows what's going to happen next. I'm expecting to wake up in the middle of a French Revolution every morning, and I should like to have you out of the country before the beheading begins." "There isn't really any danger of a revolution?" she asked breathlessly. "Not in a country where every other man's a soldier and the government's in command. But there have been houses broken into and a good many acts of lawlessness, and we're rather lonely off here." "I hate to think of going away," Marcia sighed. "We'll come back in the autumn, won't we, Uncle Howard?" "Oh, yes, if you like. I dare say we could manage a month or so out here before we go into the palazzo for the winter." "And I'll be going back to America for the winter," she sighed. He looked at her with a slight smile. "Are you the girl, Marcia, who used to preach sermons to your uncle about Americans living abroad?" Marcia reflected his smile somewhat wanly. "And I'm practising my own preaching, am I not?" "Oh, well," he said, "when the time comes you can do as you please. Your father can get along without you 1 year more." "No, I think I ought to go, for of course he must be lonely, but I should like to stay. It seems more like home than any place I've ever been in. I've really never belonged anywhere before, and I like so much to be with you." "Poor little girl, you have had a checkered career." "Yes, Uncle Howard, I have, and it keeps on being checkered. I haven't been in the villa 3 months, but really I don't remember ever having lived so long in one place before. It's been nice, hasn't it? I hate dreadfully to have it end. It seems like shutting away a whole part of my life that can never come back." "Oh, well, if you feel that way about it, I'll buy the villa, and we can come out every spring. You can bring your father over, and we will dip him in the waters of Lethe, too." "I'm afraid he wouldn't be dipped," she laughed. "He'd be running a cable connection out here, and setting up a ticker on the terrace, so that he could watch the stock market as well as the view." Mr. Copley's mouth twitched slightly at the picture. "We must all ride our hobbies, I suppose, or the world would be a very dreary world indeed." She looked up at him and hesitated. "Uncle Howard, do you and papa, that is, do you mind my asking, are you very good friends?" Mr. Copley frowned a moment without replying. "Well, Marcia, he's a good deal older than I, and we're not particularly congenial." He straightened his shoulders with a laugh. "Oh, well, there's no use concealing disagreeable truths. It appears they will out in the end. As a matter of fact, your father and I haven't had anything to do with each other for the past 10 years. The first move was on his part, when he wrote about you last fall. You didn't know that you came as an olive branch, did you?" "I didn't know. He didn't tell me anything about it, but I sort of guessed. I'm sorry about it, Uncle Howard. I'm sure that is just because you don't understand each other." "I'm afraid we never have understood each other, and I doubt if we ever can, but we'll make another effort." "It's so hard to like people when you don't understand them, and so easy when you do," said Marcia. "It facilitates matters," he agreed.
"I think I'm beginning to understand Mr. Sybert," she added somewhat vaguely. "He's different, when you understand him, from the way you thought he was when you didn't understand him."
"Ah, Sybert." Mr. Copley raised his head, and brought his eyes back from the edge of the landscape. "I thought I knew him, but he's been a revelation to me this spring."
"How do you mean?" Marcia asked, striving to keep out of her tone the interest that was behind it.
"Oh, the way he's taken hold of things. It seems an absurd thing to say, but I believe he's had almost as much influence as the police in quieting the trouble. He has an unbelievably strong hold on the people. How he got it, I don't know. He understands them as well as an Italian, and yet he is a foreigner, which gives him, in some ways, a great advantage. They trust him because they think that, being a foreigner, he has nothing to make out of it. He's a marvellous fellow when it comes to action."
"You never would guess it to look at him," she returned. "Why does he pretend to be so bored?"
"Be so bored? Well, I suppose there are some things that do bore him, and the ones that don't, bore other people. His opinions are not universally popular in Rome, and, being a diplomatist, I dare say he thinks it as well to keep them to himself."
"What are his opinions?" she asked tentatively. "I don't like to accuse him of being an anarchist, since he assures me that he is not. But when a man wants to overthrow the government——"
"Nonsense! Sybert doesn't want to overthrow the government any more than I do. Just at present it's under the control of a few corrupt politicians, but that's a thing that's likely to happen in any country, and it's only a temporary evil. The Italians will be on their feet again in a year or so, all the better for their shaking up, and Sybert knows it. He's got more real faith in a government than most of the Italians I know."
"But he talks against it terribly."
"Well, he sees the evil. He's been looking at it pretty closely, and he knows it's there. And when Sybert feels a thing, he feels it strongly. But," Copley smiled, "while he says things himself against the country, you'll find he'll not let any one else say them."
"What do people think about him now, being mixed up in all these riots?"
"Oh, just now he's mixed up on the right side, and the officials are very willing to pat him on the back. But as for the populace, I'm afraid he's not making himself over liked. They have a most immoral tendency to sympathise with the side that's against the law, and they can't understand their friends not sympathising with the same side. It's a pretty hard thing for him to have to tell these poor fellows to be quiet and go back to their work and starve in silence." Copley sighed and folded his arms. "I am sorry, Marcia, you don't like Sybert better. There are not many like him." Marcia let the observation pass without comment. The next morning, as Mrs. Copley and Marcia were sitting on the loggia listlessly engaged with books and embroidery, there came whirring down the avenue the contessa's immaculate little victoria, with the yellow coronet emblazoned on the sides, with the coachman and footman in the Torrinieri livery, green with yellow pipings. It was a gay little affair. It matched the contessa. She stepped out, pretty and debonair, in a fluttering pale green summer gown, and ran forward to the loggia with a little exclamation of distress. "Cara signora, signorina, I am desolated. We must part. Is it not sad? I go with Bartolomeo was the count, to plant olive orchards on his estate in the Abruzzi. Is it not lonely that, to spend the summer in an empty castle on the top of a mountain, with only a view for company? And my friends at the baths or the lakes or in Switzerland, everywhere except on my mountain top." Marcia laughed at the contessa's despair. "But why do you go, contessa, if you do not like it?" she inquired. "But my husband likes it. He has a passion for farming. After roulette, it is his chief amusement. He is very pastoral, Bartolomeo. He adores the mountain and the view and the olive orchards. And in Italy, signorina, the wife has to do as the husband wishes." "I'm afraid the wives had to do that the world over, contessa." "Ah, no, signorina, you cannot tell me that. I have seen. In America the husband does as the wife wishes. It is a beautiful country, truly. You have many charming customs. Yes, I will give you good advice. You will be wise to marry an American. They do not like mountain tops. But perhaps you will visit me on my mountain top?" she asked. "The view. Ah, the beautiful view. It is not so bad." "I'm afraid not, contessa. We are leaving for the Tyrol ourselves a week from to morrow." "So soon? Every one is going. Truly, the world comes to an end next week in Rome." Marcia found herself growing unexpectedly cordial toward their guest. Even the contessa appeared suddenly dear as she was about to be snatched away. She bade her an almost affectionate farewell, and stood by the balustrade waving her handkerchief until the carriage disappeared. "Will marvels never cease?" she asked her aunt. I really think that I like the contessa." End of chapter 20. Read by Céline Major.